As a candidate writing about slavery history, there is most often a question that is posed to candidate that to what extent did the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763 contributed to the American War of Independence? We are going to look at that. In this question, the first part of it, we are going to look at how the 7 Years' War contributed to the American War of Independence. Don't forget, I said the 7 Years' War was a war whereby Britain fought against France and Spain in North America in order to defend these 13 colonies that were founded by British citizens. The only relation that Britain had with these 13 colonies before the 7 Years' War was just the fact that Britain needed to come to the rescue of the 13 colonies that were facing threat from France, Spain, and the Red Indians. So, when British fought the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, the British defeated France and Spain and signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles against territories. Now, how did the 7 Years' War contribute to the American War of Independence? We are going to look at how the 7 Years' War that was fought by Britain against France and Spain contributed to the American War of Independence. The first point we are going to be looking at, it is that when Britain fought against France and Spain, the British defeated France and Spain, and the relations that existed between Britain and the 13 colonies was no longer there. And when Britain defeated France and Spain, it means that the 13 colonies were free. They did no longer need the British, because the only support that they needed from the British was that Britain should come and rescue them from the threat that was posed against them by France and Spain. So, with the defeat of France and Spain, the 13 colonies felt that they were no longer interested, or they did not need the British in their colony. That is the first way in which the 7 Years' War contributed to the American War of Independence. Because after the war, the colonies fell, the 13 colonies fell, they did not need the support of Britain any longer, since the threat was no longer there. The second point we talk about, again, the relations that the colonies wanted Britain to come and fight against the Red Indians, who were also posing another threat to Britain, was destroyed. The Red Indians were another threat to the 13 colonies. So when the British defeated the Red Indians, France and Spain, the 13 colonies felt that without the British, they can also go a long way to defeat the Red Indians and have their security in America. And because of that, they needed the British to leave, because they did not need them to protect them from the Red Indians, unlike with the case of France and Spain. The third reason how the American War, or the 7 Years' War, contributed to the American War of Independence, we are now talking about the attempts by Britain to prevent a future war. Britain wanted to prevent a future war that would erupt between her and the 13 colonies, or France and the 13 colonies. And in order to do so, Britain passed an act called the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act was passed in 1774. According to this Quebec Act, the British grant access or toleration to French Catholic Canadians to settle in the Ohio Valley. And because of this, the Puritans in the 13 colonies were not given access to move to the west of America, because going to the west, they were going to clash with the French Catholic Canadians that have settled in the Ohio Valley. And because of that, the Puritans were not happy with the British. They became alienated with the fact that the British has passed the Quebec Act of 1774, which grants access to French Catholic Canadians to the Ohio Valley, which was a threat to the 13 colonies moving to the west of America. And because of that, the 13 colonies were not happy with Britain So the next step was that they needed to fight against the British. We move forward to look at another reason, the fourth way through which the 7 Years' War contributed to the American War of Independence was the fact that the British soldiers exposed their weaknesses in guerrilla warfare or ambush. During the 7 Years' War, the British soldiers were fighting France and Spain in America through guerrilla warfare or ambush. And because of this, the British soldiers were not well fought, or they did not fight the war very well because they were not experienced in fighting in guerrilla war. So, because of that, the American soldiers who fought alongside the British to liberate America from France and Spain discovered the weakness of the British in fighting in a guerrilla warfare, because the landscape of America only permitted the British to fight in a guerrilla warfare. And since the British soldiers were not experienced to fight in guerrilla warfare, the 13 colonies now took advantage, and after the war, they have to launch a war against Britain because they knew that the British soldiers were not good in fighting in guerrilla warfare. Another way through which the 7 Years' War contributed to the American War of Independence was the fact that during the war, most of the American soldiers who fought during the 7 Years' War, don't forget, American soldiers fought during the 7 Years' War, giving support to Britain so that they should easily defeat France and Spain. So these American soldiers that fought during the 7 Years' War, they gained a lot of experience in fighting in the 7 Years' War. They gained experience in fighting guerrilla warfare, and when the 7 Years' War came to an end, these American generals who fought during the 7 Years' War now, they have now the powers and the experience they got during the 7 Years' War to be able to stand the test of time and fought against the British and start demanding for their independence. Another important way through which the 7 Years' War contributed to the American War of Independence was the fact that the 7 Years' War ended with the British incurring a huge national debt of £130 million. When the British fought the war and incurred this amount, the British felt that they should not bear the cost of this war alone. There was a need for the British to incorporate the 13 colonies in the payment of the debt they have incurred in fighting the war. And because of trying to cause the 13 colonies to pay part of the debt, to pay their own share of the debt, the 13 colonies were not happy because of the taxation policies that were brought in their territory by the British, so as to raise money to meet up with the burden that, or the money they have incurred in fighting the 7 Years' War. And because of that, the British, or the 13 colonies, they have to revolt against the British and start asking for their independence. Again, another way through which the 7 Years' War contributed to the American War of Independence, it was the fact that the British levied arbitrary taxes on the 13 colonies. From 1764 to 1767, the British levied numerous taxes on the 13 colonies because they saw it as a means to raise money to meet up with the burden, the money they have incurred in fighting the 7 Years' War. Another reason why these taxes were levied was because the British needed money so as to maintain the territories that they have seized from France and Spain in North America at the end of the 7 Years' War, such as Canada, Florida, and the areas west of the Mississippi River that Britain seized from France and Spain, and France and Spain left North America. Again, economically, the 13 colonies at the end of the 7 Years' War experienced an economic depression in their territory. And this economic depression helps to alienate them against the British. They were not happy with the British because they felt that they have to go into an economic depression because of the activities of the British. This economic depression also was accompanied by lack of political freedom in the 13 colonies, and because of this, the 13 colonies felt that they could only fight against the British and have their independence so as to come out from the economic depression that they were involved into. Another factor on how the 7 Years' War contributed to the American War of Independence was the fact that at the end of the war, the British refused to give access to the 13 colonies to the west of America. The British prevented these colonies went to the west of America. The territories are felt that since they supported Britain in fighting against France and Spain in the 7 Years' War, they will be given access to the west of America. And when the British gave them limitation for moving to the west, reserving the west for the the Red Indians, the 13 colonies were not happy. And when they were not happy, they needed to only revolt against Britain in what was called the American War of Independence, which was to fight for their independence from the British. I have enumerated 8 points on how the 7 Years' War contributed to the American War of Independence. If a question is given in the GCE, to what extent did the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763 contributed to the American War of Independence? Your MP1, the main part 1 of the question, you are going to outline how the 7 Years' War contributed to the American War of Independence as I have explained above. MP2 of the question, you are going to explain on how other factors contributed to the American War of Independence, like the absolutism of George III. We talk about the policy of mercantilism and other factors that we'll be looking at them in our subsequent episodes. They will appear in your MP2 of the question. Now we are going to move to another part of the topic.